In the middle of a snowstorm, a retired German shepherd named Shadow heard what no one else could: the faint cries of children lost in the night. Haunted by his own past, Shadow fought through fear and storm to lead his handler into a place no one dared to look. What they discovered inside shook the entire town and turned a loyal dog into an unexpected savior. But when one child's life hung by a thread, Shadow faced the greatest test of all. What happened next is something you won't forget. The wind carried a sharp edge that morning, slicing across Cedar Falls like a blade drawn from winter's sheath. Margaret Collins stood by the kitchen window of her colonial-style house on Maple Street, staring at the frost feathering the glass. The world outside was a pale blur, snow tumbling down in sheets burying the street in silence. It had been 8 months since her son Ethan's accident, but the silence still felt heavier than any storm. Ethan's place at the table remained set as it had every day since the night a drunk driver ended his life on a rain-slicked road. A blue ceramic mug, the one painted with "World's Best Son" in faded letters, sat beside her own cup of coffee. She never drank from it. She only filled it, poured cream, and let it sit until the liquid cooled into a dull reflection of what once was. Rituals were all she had left, anchors in a life adrift. The house creaked like an old ship in a storm. Once it had been filled with laughter, Ethan bounding down the stairs in his university sweatshirt, hair sticking up at impossible angles. Now it held only the groan of settling wood and the hum of a furnace struggling against the cold. At 65, Margaret had thought she was done with war. She had served her country as an army nurse for 20 years, patching up young men broken by battle. But the real war, she discovered, came after retirement, learning how to survive the loss of a child. She took her seat at the kitchen table and wrapped her hands around her mug. The coffee scalded her palms, but the heat barely penetrated the hollowness inside. Outside, the snow kept falling relentlessly. She wondered, not for the first time, if she would ever feel warm again. It was in this winter of grief that Shadow entered her life. The Cedar Falls Police Department had called her late one night in August. A young officer's voice on the line, hesitant but desperate. "Mrs. Collins, this is Officer Bradley. We've got a dog here, a retired K9. He's not doing well. Someone said you used to specialize in PTSD cases, both human and animal. Could you come take a look?" Margaret had almost said no. She had been drowning in her own sorrow, barely able to keep herself upright. But something in the officer's tone reminded her of the young soldiers she had tended to, men who needed more than bandages, who needed someone to believe they could still be whole. Against her instincts, she agreed. The next morning, she drove to the station. That was where she first saw him, a hulking German shepherd. 85 pounds of muscle and misery curled in the corner of his kennel. His once glossy coat was dull, his brown eyes clouded. He flinched at every sound, the slam of a locker, the jingle of keys. His nameplate read simply, Shadow. Margaret had known trauma when she saw it. This dog was drowning in it. "What happened to him?" she asked the station's veterinarian. "He lost his partner," the vet explained. "Officer James Mitchell. Drug raid gone bad in Detroit. Shadow tried to save him, but..." The man's voice faltered. "He hasn't been the same since. Hyper-vigilant panic attacks, refuses to work. We're considering," he hesitated, lowering his voice, putting him down. Margaret had crouched by the kennel bars, her arthritic knees protesting. She reached out a trembling hand. Shadow didn't move, didn't growl, didn't wag his tail. He just stared, eyes flat with exhaustion. "He's a hero," she said softly. "Heroes deserve better than this." Taking him home had been like bringing a ghost into her house. Shadow paced the living room in endless circles, nails ticking on hardwood like a metronome for despair. He refused food unless Margaret sat beside his bowl. When thunderstorms rolled across Cedar Falls, he vanished beneath Ethan's old bed, trembling until the sky cleared. She recognized every symptom because she lived with them herself. And yet, there were moments, small flickers of connection that stitched them together. The night Margaret collapsed on the kitchen floor, clutching Ethan's sweatshirt, Shadow crept out from his hiding place. He laid his head in her lap, heavy and grounding. She cried into his fur until she had no tears left, and he stayed silent witness to her unraveling. In turn, she became his anchor. She learned to speak the language of his body. The twitch of ears, signaling rising panic, the restless pacing that meant a storm was brewing inside his mind. She sang softly when he shook the same lullabies she had sung to Ethan as a boy. Slowly, a fragile trust grew between them. Neither could replace what they had lost, but together, they built something new: companionship forged in the fire of shared wounds. That January morning, Shadow paced the kitchen again. Not the tight circles of panic, but long strides from window to door, ears pricked forward. He whined low and uneasy, as if the storm carried more than snow. Margaret set down her mug. "What is it, boy?" she asked, scratching behind his ears. Shadow pulled away, a rare gesture almost unheard of since their bond had deepened. His amber eyes fixed on the horizon, beyond the glass posture taut like a drawn bow. He barked once, sharp and urgent, the sound ricocheting through the house like a gunshot. Margaret flinched. It had been months since she'd heard him bark with such authority. For a moment, it was as if the old Shadow, the decorated K9. The unflinching officer was standing in her kitchen, resurrected from the ashes of trauma. Margaret's breath caught. She didn't know what the bark meant, not yet. But she felt it in her bones. Something was coming. The phone rang, its shrill tone slicing through the silence. She crossed the room, lifted the receiver. Sheriff Daniel Hayes' voice crackled down the line, heavy with exhaustion. "Margaret, I hate to ask, but we've got an emergency. 6 children from Cedar Falls Elementary are missing. A storm came in fast yesterday. They never made it home." The mug slipped from her hand, shattering on the kitchen tiles, coffee spreading like dark blood across the floor. Shadow was at her side instantly, assessing her for injury training, overriding fear. Missing Margaret whispered. How long since yesterday afternoon? Over 12 hours in sub-zero temperatures. Hayes's voice cracked. My granddaughter Sophia is one of them. Margaret's nurse's mind began calculating survival odds. 6 to 12-year-olds, minus 15 degrees, over 12 hours. The math was merciless. What can I do? We're organizing search teams. We need every able body. Can you join us? Margaret looked down at Shadow. He was standing rigid, body angled toward town, as if tethered by invisible string to some unseen destination. His tail was high, his breath sharp. For the first time in months, he looked alive. I'll be there in 30 minutes, she said. She hung up the phone, heart hammering. Outside, the blizzard howled. Inside, Shadow barked again, commanding, purposeful. Margaret wrapped her scarf around her neck, pulled on her heavy coat, and knelt before the dog. Looks like we're not done fighting after all, she whispered. Shadow's ears twitched. His eyes locked with hers. In that gaze, Margaret saw a reflection of her own grief, her own resilience. 2 broken souls answering the call of something greater than sorrow. Shadow's story was written in scars that no one could see. Before Margaret had ever heard his name, before his paws had traced endless circles on her living room floor, Shadow had been a legend in Detroit's K9 unit. Photographs of him still hung on precinct walls, a sleek German shepherd in a tactical harness. Brown eyes burning with focused jaws, clenched on a suspect's arm as his handler, Officer James Mitchell, gave commands with calm authority. Together, they had brought down drug rings, found missing children, and pulled survivors from wreckage. They had been more than partners. They had been family. Then came the raid. Margaret had pieced the story together from Whisper's old case files and the haunted silence that always fell when officers spoke of that night. A warehouse raid on a narcotics operation. A team of officers stormed the building. Shadow went in with Mitchell, as always fearless in the face of danger. Shots rang out, smoke filled the air, and by the time backup reached them, Mitchell was gone, felled by a bullet to the chest. Shadow had been found beside him, covered in blood, his paws pressed against Mitchell's uniform as though he could stop life from spilling out. He had refused to leave the body, growling at medics who tried to pull him away. When they finally dragged him out, his muzzle was torn, his body bruised, and something inside him had fractured beyond repair. After that night, Shadow never worked again. His once razor-sharp focus dissolved into panic at loud noises. Fireworks, thunder, even the slamming of a door could send him cowering, shaking violently. His trainers had tried, but he failed every exercise. Eventually, the department made a choice: euthanasia or retirement. By luck or fate, he landed in Margaret's care. Margaret didn't need a medical degree to see what haunted him. She knew PTSD well. She had seen it in soldiers who returned from battlefields with 1,000-yard stares, unable to sleep, unable to silence the memories of explosions and screams. The human mind could be shattered by trauma. Why not a dog's? Her first week with Shadow had been brutal. Every thunderclap turned her house into a war zone. The moment the sky rumbled, Shadow disappeared beneath Ethan's old bed, a trembling heap of fur. Margaret tried coaxing him out with treats, gentle words, even silence. Nothing worked. She sat on the floor outside the bedroom, back pressed to the wall, listening to his claws scrape the floorboards as he shook. One night, lightning lit up the windows, and Shadow whimpered so loudly it tore through Margaret's chest. She crawled under the bed herself, pressing against the dusty floorboards, her knees aching. Slowly, she slid her hand onto his back. He flinched, then stilled. The storm raged, thunder cracking. But Margaret whispered softly, not words of command, but lullabies she had once sung to Ethan, simple melodies meant to soothe a child's fear of the dark. By the time the storm passed, Shadow's trembling had eased. His head rested against her thigh, eyes half closed, exhaustion overtaking panic. Margaret realized then that healing wasn't about erasing the ghosts. It was about teaching someone they weren't alone when the ghosts came knocking. Days became weeks, and Margaret began learning Shadow's language. When his ears twitched sharply, it meant he'd heard something that set him on edge. When his tail lowered and curled between his legs, he was bracing for fear. The tight pacing 3-foot circles on hardwood meant his mind was spiraling into memories he couldn't escape. She adjusted her life around him, not out of pity, but out of respect. She turned down the television when gunshots echoed in movies. She moved Ethan's old bed into her own room, letting Shadow crawl beneath whenever he needed refuge. She learned when to touch him, steady hand on his back, gentle scratch behind the ears, and when to simply sit nearby, silent companion to his pain. In turn, Shadow began watching her too. He noticed when her hands trembled as she set Ethan's mug on the table each morning. He saw the way she froze in the hallway when passing the door to her son's room, unable to enter. On nights when grief pressed like a weight on her chest, Shadow climbed onto the couch, resting his head on her lap, his body heavy enough to remind her she was not alone. Two broken souls slowly stitching each other back together. Then came the storm. The first real blizzard of the season swept down from the north, burying Cedar Falls beneath a blanket of white. Weather reports called it the fiercest storm in a decade. The kind that shut down schools, shuttered shops, and turned streets into deserts of ice. Margaret stood at her front window, watching snowdrifts climb against her fence, nearly to the top rails. The wind howled through the eaves, rattling the shutters like loose bones. The thermometer outside read -15 degrees, and the air carried a howl so fierce it made the house groan, as if protesting. Shadow was restless from dawn. He paced between the kitchen and front door, claws ticking against the hardwood. His ears were pricked, not flattened in panic, but tilted forward in sharp attention. His body was coiled energy vibrating off him. Margaret frowned. "What is it, boy?" she asked, scratching gently behind his ears. But Shadow pulled away a sign she had learned meant something serious. His eyes locked on the horizon, beyond the frost-streaked glass. He whined low and persistent tail stiff. Margaret's skin prickled. It wasn't panic, it wasn't thunder or fireworks. This was something different. Instinct, focus, purpose. She hadn't seen that look in him before. It stirred something in her, to a reminder of nights spent in field hospitals, reading soldiers' faces before they spoke. The knowledge that some things couldn't be explained, only felt. Margaret's phone rang, then shattering the tension. She picked up the receiver, and the voice on the other end belonged to Sheriff Daniel Hayes. He sounded tired, broken. "Margaret," he said, "we've got an emergency." Shadow stood by the door, muscles taut, amber eyes alive with intensity. The storm outside howled louder, beating against the windows like fists. Margaret gripped the phone, her heart hammering as the sheriff explained 6 children had vanished in the blizzard. Shadow barked, then a sharp commanding sound that echoed through the house. Margaret startled, the receiver trembling in her hand. She turned to him, chest tight. It was the bark of an officer, not a broken dog. The ghosts of his past still haunted him. But in that moment, Margaret realized something vital. Shadow's story wasn't finished. The phone trembled in Margaret's hand, the voice on the other end nearly drowned by the storm shrieking against her windows. Sheriff Daniel Hayes didn't sound like the man she had known for decades, the steady anchor of Cedar Falls law enforcement. Tonight his voice was brittle, frayed with fear. "Margaret, I hate to put this on you, but 6 children from Cedar Falls Elementary are missing. They were released early yesterday because of the storm warning. They never made it home." The words didn't land at once. They hovered heavy and unreal, as though the blizzard itself had conspired to muffle them. Missing children? The phrase didn't belong in her quiet town of snowbound streets and neighborly routines. She gripped the counter ice, darting to the world's best sun mug, still sitting cold on the table. "How long?" she asked, her voice low. "Over 12 hours, Hayes said." His breath shuddered down the line. The temperature dropped to -15 last night. "We've had search teams out since dusk, but with this weather..." His voice trailed. Then, almost as an afterthought, softer, more broken, "My granddaughter Sophia is one of them." Margaret's heart clenched. Her nurse's mind, trained by years in war zones, began running the brutal calculations. Children aged 6 to 12, exposed to sub-zero temperatures, no proper shelter, no food, no fire. The survival guide she had drilled into young medics whispered in her head after 6 hours hypothermia sets in. After 12, the odds shrink to almost nothing. The math was merciless. "Who?" Margaret asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Hayes listed the names slowly, as if each one cost him years of life. Sophia Hayes, Caleb Nguyen, Lucy Carter, Isabella Torres, Ryan Brooks, Oliver Bennett, ages 6 through 12. Margaret shut her eyes. She could see their faces, at least some of them. She had bought cookies from Lucy at last spring's bake sale, watched Caleb chase a baseball across the park with all the reckless energy of youth. Sophia, she remembered, had smiled shyly at the church potluck, clinging to her grandfather's hand. Now they were out there, swallowed by snow and silence. "What can I do?" she asked. "We're setting up at the community center. Volunteers search grids, radios. We need every able body. Can you come?" Margaret's gaze slid to Shadow. He stood by the door, muscles rigid, tail straight, ears pricked like radar. His eyes were locked on the horizon toward the abandoned industrial district. He wasn't trembling, he wasn't pacing in panic. He was waiting. "Yes," she said into the phone. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. When she hung up, Shadow barked a short, sharp blast that reverberated in her chest. Margaret nearly jumped. It wasn't the whine of fear she had grown accustomed to. This bark was purposeful, commanding the bark of a dog with a mission. "Easy, boy," she murmured, pulling on her heavy coat and scarf. But even as she spoke, she knew this was no storm-triggered episode. Something had awoken in him. She knelt before him, fingers brushing through his thick coat. "We're going out," she whispered, "and I think you already know why." His amber eyes met hers, intense, almost pleading. He gave a low whine tail, twitching, and pressed his weight against the door. The community center was chaos when Margaret arrived. Parents clutched styrofoam cups of coffee, their hands shaking too much to drink. Maps spread across folding tables, crisscrossed with markers dividing the town into search grids. Deputies huddled near the entrance radios, crackling with static-laced reports. The storm had turned every road into a trap. Snowdrifts buried cars, power lines sagged under ice, and visibility dropped to nothing. Search teams returned in cycles, frost clinging to their eyelashes, shaking their heads. Shadow pressed close to Margaret's side as they entered. Heads turned. Whispers followed. She knew what they saw, the grieving widow, who still set a place at the table for her dead son, dragging along a broken police dog, too unstable for duty. Sheriff Hayes looked up from the map. His face was drawn, eyes hollow. When he saw Margaret, relief flickered, but exhaustion smothered it quickly. "Thank God you came," he said. His voice cracked, and for a moment he was just a grandfather, not a sheriff. Margaret nodded, gripping his arm. "Tell me where you need me." "We've covered residential areas, the park creek beds." "Nothing. The industrial district is too dangerous with the storm-condemned buildings and unstable structures. No way kids would go there voluntarily." He rubbed a trembling hand over his face. But at this point, nothing makes sense. Shadow suddenly lunged toward the exit, pulling hard enough on the leash that Margaret stumbled. Heads turned again, some with sympathy, others with irritation. "Your dog's agitated," a volunteer coordinator said gently. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable helping with the phones, Mrs. Collins." Margaret looked down at Shadow. His whole body vibrated with urgency, not panic. His gaze locked on the door as though the answer lay just beyond. He whined, frustrated, then gave another sharp bark. This wasn't fear. This was insistence. She remembered the survival guide again. 24 hours. After that, chances of survival dropped to nearly zero. These children didn't have time for bureaucracy. She unclipped the leash. "Show me what you know." "You know," she whispered. Shadow bolted snow swirling in through the open doors as he bounded into the storm. Margaret grabbed her coat tighter, ignoring the startled shouts behind her, and followed him into the night. The storm swallowed them whole. Snow whipped across her face, stinging her cheeks raw. Shadow moved ahead with uncanny certainty, nose lifted to the wind, adjusting direction, as though following an invisible map. His paw prints disappeared almost instantly under fresh drifts, but his silhouette remained clear, driving forward. Margaret struggled to keep pace, boots sliding on ice lungs burning from the frigid air. Yet beneath the exhaustion, a spark flared inside her, something she hadn't felt in months. Purpose. She wasn't just a grieving mother anymore. She was a nurse again, a fighter, and beside her was not a broken animal, but a partner reborn. The streets of Cedar Falls blurred past the shuttered movie theater, the boarded-up shops, the church whose bells lay silent beneath snow. All of it fading as Shadow pulled her inexorably toward the outskirts, toward the looming silhouettes of abandoned factories that stood like gravestones of a collapsed economy. Margaret's pulse quickened. She knew where they were heading. The Hartwell canning factory, rusted, condemned, and avoided by everyone in town. Shadow stopped so suddenly she nearly collided with him. He stood rigid, ears forward, a low growl vibrating in his chest. The factory loomed ahead, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring out over the storm. Margaret's breath fogged in the air. Her hands shook not from the cold, but from the realization settling in her bones. The children weren't lost in the snow. Shadow had led them to the heart of something far darker. The community center buzzed with a low, desperate energy. Folding tables lined the walls, each stacked with radios, flashlights, and maps scribbled over with colored markers. Coffee pots hissed in the background, the bitter scent barely masking the smell of damp coats and exhaustion. Parents huddled in corners, their faces pale, clinging to each whispered update, as if it might deliver hope. Margaret stood among them. Shadow pressed close to her leg. He was restless, his breathing sharp and shallow muscles coiled like a spring. Every sound, every movement seemed to feed his agitation. Volunteers milled around, dividing into search groups, but Shadow had no patience for their planning. His focus was elsewhere, on the storm still raging outside. Sheriff Hayes raised his voice over the hum of anxious chatter. "We'll cover residential grids again, creeks and wooded areas too. The industrial district is off limits until conditions improve. Too unstable." At that, Shadow jerked forward, pulling hard enough on the leash that Margaret nearly lost her footing. He barked once, loud and insistent, startling the room into silence. Dozens of eyes turned toward her, pity, skepticism, and something sharper, judgment. A volunteer coordinator approached, speaking in the hushed tone people reserved for fragile things. "Mrs. Collins, maybe it's best if you stay here. Help with phone calls. Your dog, he seems unsettled." Margaret looked down at Shadow. His body vibrated with tension, but his tail was not tucked, his ears were not pinned back. She had learned the difference by now. This wasn't fear. This was certainty. He strained against the leash claws, scraping on the linoleum floor as he dragged her toward the exit. He gave another sharp bark, then whined in frustration when she resisted. His amber eyes locked with hers, pleading, commanding, unyielding. Margaret's heart hammered. She thought of the survival odds again. 12 hours already lost. 12 more and the children's chances plummeted to nearly nothing. Margaret Hayes said softly, "I know you want to help. But this isn't the time for risks. Let the trained teams handle it." She met his weary gaze, then looked back at Shadow. The German shepherd trembled not with panic, but with urgency, his nose pressed to the door, as though he could smell the truth waiting beyond. Margaret tightened her grip on the leash. Then slowly, deliberately, she unclipped it. "Show me," she whispered. Shadow bolted the door, banging open, as a blast of snow and wind surged inside. Gasps followed them, voices calling her name, but Margaret didn't turn back. She pulled her coat tighter, lowered her head against the storm, and followed the dog into the night. The blizzard swallowed them instantly. Snow whipped sideways, stinging her cheeks and blinding her eyes. The cold tore at her lungs with every breath, raw and merciless. Yet through it all, Shadow moved with unwavering purpose. His dark form cut through the white like an arrow tail, high ears pricked, adjusting his course with subtle shifts of his head. Margaret stumbled after him, boots slipping on ice, heart pounding. Fear gnawed at the edges of her resolve, whispering that she was foolish, that grief had blinded her to reason. But the sight of Shadow, focused, determined, alive, kept her moving. He was not the broken creature she had brought home months ago. Not the dog, trembling beneath Ethan's old bed during thunderstorms. Tonight, he was something else entirely. Tonight, he was what he had once been, a K-9 officer on duty. They passed through downtown Cedar Falls, the storm transforming familiar streets into alien landscapes. Snow-buried storefronts draped church steeples, erased road signs. The theater marquee, once advertising children's movies, was a frozen tombstone under icicles. Margaret's muscles screamed as she trudged forward, but Shadow never slowed. Occasionally he stopped, nose lifted, testing the wind before veering decisively down another street. He seemed to be following a scent only he could detect, invisible threads woven through the storm. "Please," Margaret panted through chattering teeth. "Tell me you know where you're going." Shadow glanced back, once ears twitching, then pressed on. As they left the heart of town, the buildings grew fewer, replaced by skeletal remains of the industrial district. Factories loomed in the blizzard, hulking silhouettes with broken windows gaping like empty eye sockets. Their rusted frames groaned under the weight of snow relics of a more prosperous era long since abandoned. Margaret's stomach tightened. She remembered Sheriff Hayes's warning: condemned buildings, unstable structures. No place for children. And yet Shadow's stride quickened his growl, low, his body pulling toward one factory in particular. The Whitaker Canning Factory. It had been shuttered after the economic collapse in 2008, left to decay on the edge of town. For years it had been a place of rumors. Teenagers dared each other to sneak inside, whispers of accidents and hauntings clinging to its crumbling walls. Margaret stopped, chest heaving, staring at the looming building. Its massive brick frame rose from the snow like a tomb. Windows shattered, doors sagging from rusted hinges. The storm pressed against it, snowdrifts piling against loading docks as though the world itself wanted to bury it. Shadow froze at the base of the steps, body rigid. His ears pricked forward, every muscle taut, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. He paced once in a tight circle, then fixed his gaze on the side entrance. His hackles rose, not in panic, but in alert readiness. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She pulled it from her pocket, but the screen glowed weakly. No signal. The storm had knocked out the towers. She looked back at Shadow. His breath steamed in the cold eyes locked on the dark mouth of the factory. His entire being radiated urgency. Margaret swallowed hard. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to wait for backup. But another voice, the voice honed by years as a nurse cut through time, is everything. 24 hours. After that, children lost in this storm would not be found alive. "All right, Shadow," she whispered, pulling her scarf tighter. "If you're right, this is where we find them." Shadow barked once, sharp and certain, the sound swallowed by the storm. Together they stepped toward the Whitaker factory, into the teeth of the blizzard, into the unknown. The Whitaker Canning Factory rose out of the blizzard like the skeleton of a fallen giant. Its brick walls were scarred by decades of neglect, mortar crumbling in jagged lines. Windows shattered into hollow sockets that gaped at the storm. Rusted girders jutted like broken bones, and long icicles hung from bent gutters, gleaming faintly in the weak light of the street lamps, swallowed by snow. Margaret stopped at the edge of the loading dock chest, heaving boots sinking deep into the drifts. The cold gnawed at her fingers, even through her thick gloves. Shadow stood ahead of her body, rigid, every hair along his spine bristling. His breath rose in heavy plumes. Ears pinned forward, nose twitching as he scanned the night air. The factory had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades. Yet in the howling storm, it seemed alive, pulsing with a quiet menace. The wind moaned through broken rafters, creating ghostly whistles that echoed across the courtyard. Margaret shivered, not from the cold this time, but from the feeling that the building itself was watching her. "Shadow," she whispered, voice nearly lost in the gale. "What have you brought me to?" The dog growled low in his throat, a deep vibration that traveled into the soles of her boots. Not aggression warning. She tightened her scarf and forced herself forward. The main loading bay was blocked by a drift of snow as high as her chest. Shadow ignored it, tugging her toward a side door half hidden by the storm. The metal frame was bent, the lock mangled as though pried open with brute force. Snow had piled against it, but not enough to cover the disturbance. Margaret crouched, brushing away the powder with her glove. There, beneath the thin layer of ice, were tire tracks. Fresh ones. The tread marks were still sharp, not yet blurred by snowfall. She pressed her palm against the impression, cold seeping through the fabric of her glove. Whoever had come here had arrived recently, within hours, perhaps less. Her stomach tightened. She straightened, scanning the entrance again. The door sagged slightly on its hinges, as if it had been forced from the outside. Rust flaked under her touch. No one in town would have reason to be here. Not in a storm like this. Shadow pawed at the threshold, whining, his body vibrating with impatience. He wanted inside. Margaret hesitated. She had no weapon, no backup, only a dog with scars in his mind and frost clinging to his fur. Her phone still showed no signal. The community center, the sheriff, the volunteers, they might as well have been on the other side of the world. Then the sound reached her. At first she thought it was the storm playing tricks. A faint rise and fall carried on the wind, like distant bells. She held her breath, straining to listen. It came again, soft, melodic, unmistakably human. Children's voices. Singing. Margaret's heart jolted. She pressed her ear against the warped doorframe, snow seeping into her coat as she leaned close. The melody grew clearer, thin and reedy, but synchronized a hymn she recognized from childhood Sundays in church. Innocent voices harmonized in eerie precision, carrying words of salvation into the hollow factory. Her chest constricted. The missing children. They had to be here. But why were they singing? Shadow's growl deepened. He paced in a tight circle, glancing between her and the door, torn between protective instinct and professional drive. His hackles stood high-tail stiff. He pressed against her thigh, urging her forward, then pawed the snow again with sharp insistence. Margaret's pulse thundered in her ears. Something was deeply wrong. Children lost in a blizzard did not sing hymns in a condemned building. She wrapped her fingers around the door handle. The metal burned with cold. The hinges groaned faintly under the pressure. Her breath plumed in ragged clouds. "All right," she whispered to Shadow. "We go together." She pushed. The door screeched open with a drawn-out wail echoing through the cavernous interior. The smell hit her first, damp concrete rust mold, and something sharper beneath it all, like candle wax and stale incense. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a vast chamber littered with rusted machinery. Conveyor belts lay frozen in mid-motion gears, corroded and lifeless. Dust motes swirled in the faint shafts of moonlight, piercing broken skylights. The hymn floated through the shadows, steady, almost mechanical in its rhythm. Children's voices carried upward, bouncing off the steel beams, filling the emptiness with a sound at once beautiful and horrifying. Shadow crept forward, every movement precise, muscles taut. He scanned the gloom with quick flicks of his head nose, working furiously. His low growl rumbled again, echoing off the walls, like distant thunder. Margaret followed, boots crunching on scattered debris. The cold inside the factory was sharper, more penetrating, as if the building itself hoarded the storm's cruelty. Her breath rose in white clouds, dissolving into the cavernous space. She swept her flashlight across the floor and froze. Children's drawings covered the concrete walls, scrawled in crayon, smiling stick figures, suns with long rays, angels with halos. They looked recent, the colors still bright, not faded by time. Beneath one drawing lay a blanket folded neatly beside a paper cup tipped on its side. Margaret's throat tightened. The children had been here, and not long ago. Shadow stopped abruptly. His ears shot forward, body low, a silent hunter's stance. He released a sharp bark that reverberated through the chamber. The hymn faltered for a moment, as though the singers had been startled. Margaret's heart pounded. She tightened her grip on the flashlight. The voices picked up again, louder now, echoing from deeper within the maze of machinery and shadows. She crouched beside Shadow, one hand on his thick fur, feeling the tremors of tension rippling through him. His gaze was fixed ahead, unblinking amber eyes glowing faintly in the beam of her light. "Easy," she whispered. though the word was as much for herself as for him. The hymn drifted closer, weaving through the dark like a thread pulling them deeper. Margaret rose slowly, blood roaring in her ears, and stepped forward. Shadow padded at her side, silent but alert, his growl humming like a warning signal. The factory swallowed them whole, every step, carrying them further into its belly, toward the voices that should not have been there, toward the truth waiting in the shadows. The hymn grew clearer as Margaret and Shadow pushed deeper into the factory. Their footsteps echoed against the concrete, the sound of crunching glass and rusted bolts snapping underfoot. The beam of her flashlight wavered over abandoned machinery conveyor belts that hadn't run in decades, graffiti scrawled in angry colors across crumbling brick. But threaded through all of it was that strange, unwavering chorus, children's voices lifting together in a song that belonged in Sunday morning pews, not in a condemned ruin at the height of a blizzard. Margaret's stomach clenched. They rounded a corner formed by a massive rusted boiler, and the light landed on a sight that stopped her heart. 6 children sat in a perfect circle on the factory floor. Blankets were draped over their shoulders, paper cups steaming faintly in their hands. Their faces pale, rosy-cheeked from the cold, lifted in song voices blending with eerie precision. At the center of the circle sat Reverend Samuel Whitaker. His silver hair caught the weak glow of a lantern placed on the floor, gleaming like a halo. He wore his clerical collar, though the black fabric of his coat was dusted white with snow. His hands rose gently, conducting the children as though they were a choir. His expression was serene, even joyful, as the hymn carried through the cavernous space. For a moment, relief washed through Margaret. The missing children were alive. They were warm. They were with a man. The town respected a man known for his kindness and service. The nightmare of the blizzard had not swallowed them after all. But the relief did not last. Shadow's body stiffened beside her. His hackles, bristled ears, pinned back teeth bared in a low, rolling growl. The sound vibrated against Margaret's leg, primal and certain. He did not see safety here. He saw threat. "Shadow," she whispered urgently, gripping his collar. Quiet. But the German shepherd's instincts were unshakable. He kept his eyes locked on the pastor, every line of his body taut, his growl deepening as the hymn continued. Margaret forced herself to look closer. At first, everything seemed orderly, the children sitting in their circle, their blankets wrapped snug, the cups steaming. But as her nurse's eyes scanned their faces, details sharpened into something deeply wrong. Their expressions were vacant. Their eyes, glassy and unfocused, stared forward without truly seeing. Their voices rose in perfect unison, mechanical, almost robotic, with none of the playful spontaneity children carried, even in rehearsed songs. And the cups, she noticed them now. 6 paper cups arranged with precision, each placed carefully in front of the children, filled with a dark red liquid that steamed faintly in the lantern glow. Her stomach turned. Margaret Collins, Reverend Whitaker's voice, carried warmly across the factory floor. The children's song faltered at the intrusion, their heads turning in eerie unison, their young eyes fixed on her with unsettling calm. The pastor rose slowly to his feet, his movements deliberate, his face split in a smile of paternal welcome. "My dear, what are you doing here in this storm?" Margaret forced her trembling hand to lower the flashlight, casting its beam aside so it wouldn't glare directly into his face. She struggled to find her voice. "The town, the children. Everyone's searching. We thought," she swallowed hard, "we thought they were lost." Whitaker spread his arms in a gesture of reassurance. "Lost, no. I found them. God guided me through the storm, brought me here to shelter them. Look." He gestured to the circle of children, to their blankets, their steaming cups. "They are safe. Warm. Fed. You see, the Lord never abandons his little ones." On the surface, his words held comfort, but Shadow's growl was unrelenting, sharp barks, threatening to burst forth with each syllable the pastor spoke. Margaret's nurse's instincts screamed at her too. Something about the scene was off, deeply off. The children did not fidget, did not shift or whisper or giggle as children would. They stared, eyes glazed, lips moving mechanically as the hymn resumed at the pastor's subtle wave of his hand. And those cups. Margaret stepped forward, voice steadier now. What's in their drinks? Whitaker's smile flickered just for a moment before he answered smoothly. Hot chocolate, of course. What else would you give frightened little ones on a night like this? It soothes them, helps them rest. Shadow barked once, loud and sharp. The children flinched, their song faltering again. Whitaker's gaze snapped to the dog eyes, narrowing the warmth in his expression, tightening like a mask stretched too thin. Margaret's pulse thundered. She forced herself to take in more details. Crayon drawings pinned to the nearby wall. Angels with wings, children holding hands beneath clouds. Religious verses chalked in shaky script across the concrete. Let the little children come to me. And near the makeshift altar, Whitaker had assembled at the far end of the circle. She saw it 6 more cups identical to the ones already steaming in the children's hands, arranged in perfect symmetry, waiting. Her mouth went dry. Reverend, she said carefully, the whole town is frantic. Their families are desperate. We need to take them back. Whitaker's smile widened again, but it did not reach his eyes. He stepped closer, his voice lowering to a soothing murmur. Margaret, you don't understand. Out there, the world is cruel. Drunk drivers kill sons. Violence takes innocence. Storms devour the weak. But here he gestured to the circle. Here they are safe. Here they are at peace. The reference to drunk drivers hit her like a knife. He knew about Ethan, knew about the accident that had shattered her life. And he was using her pain as proof of his twisted logic. Shadow snarled now, teeth bared, ready to spring. Margaret tightened her grip, her own fear mounting. She looked again at the children. Sophia Hayes, her grandfather's granddaughter, sat near the front. Her lips moved with the hymn, but her eyes, those wide glassy eyes, looked directly at Margaret for a fleeting second. Beneath the dull haze, Margaret glimpsed something else. Confusion, fear, the faint flicker of awareness trapped behind the drugged calm. It was enough to solidify her worst suspicion. The children weren't rescued. They were being controlled. Her gaze flicked back to the cups. The steam rose steadily, and beneath it lingered a faintly sweet chemical tang she recognized from her years in hospitals. Not cocoa, not chocolate. Something else. Her heart froze. Sedatives. Margaret drew a long, shaky breath. She stepped into the dim light of the lantern, her voice steady, though her insides trembled. Reverend Whitaker, whatever you think you're doing, it isn't safe. These children need real shelter, real care. Their parents who cannot protect them. His voice cracked like a whip, startling even himself. The mask slipped, and in its place came raw anguish. His hands shook as he clutched his collar. I lost my Grace. She was pure innocent, and the world took her anyway. I will not let that happen again. These little ones will be spared. Shadow barked again, sharp, authoritative, cutting through the hymn. The children faltered once more, their voices trembling. Margaret's pulse pounded as the pieces fell into place. The factory, the verses on the walls, the prepared cups, the unnatural stillness of the children. This was not sanctuary. This was preparation. She glanced at Shadow. His stance had shifted wide and sure, every muscle humming with restrained power. His eyes burned fixed on the pastor. He knew what she now knew. Reverend Samuel Whitaker was not a rescuer. He was the danger. Reverend Samuel Whitaker stood tall in the center of the circle, his clerical collar gleaming pale against the shadows, his silver hair haloed by the lantern's glow. His voice, deep and soothing, filled the cavernous factory with a confidence that made Margaret's skin crawl. You see, Margaret, he said, spreading his arms, as though addressing a congregation out there, the world is merciless. It devours innocence. But in here, his voice softened to a near whisper. I can offer them freedom, release, eternal salvation. The children sat unmoving. Their eyes glazed, their hands still curled around the cups that steamed faintly in the cold air. The hymn had faded to silence, but the echo of their voices still haunted the walls. Shadow's growl rumbled low and steady, vibrating through the soles of Margaret's boots. He hadn't taken his eyes off Whitaker. Margaret's pulse thundered. She fought to keep her breathing steady, to keep her mind sharp. You think drugging children is salvation? She said, forcing her voice to carry calm she did not feel. Whitaker turned his gaze to her eyes, shining with feverish conviction. Not drugs. Sacrament. This is no ordinary wine, Margaret. It is blessed. Holy, a final drink to carry them beyond suffering, to keep them forever pure. Margaret's stomach clenched. She recognized the scent rising from the cups, faint but undeniable sedatives, laced with something stronger, something dangerous. If the children drank enough, they wouldn't wake. Reverend, she said carefully, they don't need salvation. They need their parents. Their parents love them. Love. His voice cracked raw and violent. He stepped closer, trembling. Love did not save my Grace. The words thundered in the factory, ricocheting off rusted beams. His eyes blazed wet with unshed tears, and his hands shook as he clutched his chest. My daughter was everything. Pure, kind. She sang hymns with me every morning, Margaret. Every morning, and yet the world took her. A drunk driver shattered her body on the road and left me with nothing but silence. Margaret froze, breath catching. The parallel struck her like a blow Grace lost to a drunk driver, just as Ethan had been. Whitaker's voice dropped, breaking into a tremor. I promised her. I promised Grace I would never let the world take another child. And so I will save them. These 6 will not suffer as she did. They will go to her to heaven, untouched by cruelty. Shadow's growl rose louder now, teeth bared. His body was angled protectively in front of Margaret, every muscle ready to spring. Margaret forced her voice steady. Reverend, listen to yourself. You're talking about killing them. His face hardened, but his voice remained calm, almost tender. Not killing. Freeing. They are already halfway there, Margaret. Look at them. He gestured to the children, their blank stares, their docile stillness. They feel no fear, no pain. Already they are closer to peace than they've ever been. Do you not see? This world poisons innocence. I am the antidote. Margaret's heart raced. She glanced at Sophia Hayes, the sheriff's granddaughter. The girl's lips trembled faintly, as though part of her still fought against the drug's pull. Margaret clung to that flicker, desperate to believe the children weren't fully lost. Reverend, she said gently, taking a cautious step forward, you loved your daughter. I loved my son. I lost him too. A drunk driver took him from me, just as you lost Grace. I know the grief that crushes you. But this, she gestured to the children, to the steaming cups. This isn't the answer. You're not saving them. You're stealing them from the people who love them most. Whitaker's jaw tightened. For a moment, doubt flickered in his eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He lifted his chin, conviction tightening his voice. The world will call it madness. But Grace waits for me. And when I bring these children to her, she will welcome them. They will be together forever, spared. Margaret's pulse hammered. She had to buy time. With no phone signal, no way to summon help, her only hope was keeping him talking, stretching out the minutes until the storm passed or someone followed her trail. You think Grace would want this? She asked softly. You think she would welcome children taken from their families, frightened and drugged, brought here against their will? Whitaker's eyes narrowed. You twisted. I don't. Margaret pressed. Grace was a child, Reverend. Innocent. Do you truly believe she would want other children to suffer so she could have company? His hands shook. His voice faltered. She was lonely. She was loved. Margaret cut in sharply. Her throat tightened, but she forced the words. Just as these children are loved, their parents are tearing themselves apart right now, searching through the storm. You know what it's like to lose a child. Would you inflict that agony on 6 more families? For the first time, Reverend Whitaker's composure cracked. His eyes glistened, his lips trembling, as if caught between denial and despair. Shadow barked suddenly, sharp and commanding. The sound jolted the children. A few blinked rapidly, confusion flashing across their faces before the haze reclaimed them. Margaret seized on the moment. You see that, she said, her voice rising. They are still here, Reverend. They are not gone. They want to live. They want to go home. Whitaker staggered back a step, pressing his hands over his ears. No. No, you do not understand. I must do this. The world cannot have them. He moved toward the altar at the far end of the room, where more cups waited in symmetrical rows. His hand hovered above one, trembling. Shadow stepped forward, lips curled in a snarl, every fiber of his being focused on the pastor. His body quivered with restrained violence, waiting for Margaret's word. Margaret's heart raced. She kept her eyes locked on Whitaker. Samuel, she said softly, using his first name for the first time. You loved Grace. You are broken because she was taken from you. But don't twist that love into something monstrous. These children aren't yours to offer up. They're not your salvation. For a moment, silence filled the factory. Only the sound of the storm seeping through broken windows broke at a hollow wail that seemed to carry the weight of judgment. Whitaker lowered his hands, shoulders sagging. His face crumpled, anguish spilling across his features. For a heartbeat, Margaret thought she had reached him. Then his eyes hardened again. His voice steadied, almost serene. It is too late. The sacrament has begun. Soon they will be beyond reach, and when the last drop is swallowed, they will be safe forever. Margaret's blood ran cold. Shadow's growl swelled a storm in his chest. Margaret crouched beside him, fingers digging into his fur. Her heart pounded as she whispered, "Stay with me." "Not yet. Wait." The children sat in their circle cups, steaming in their hands, eyes blank but fragile, teetering between life and oblivion. The lantern light flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the cracked concrete floor. The circle of children sat motionless, their small hands clutching the paper cups that steamed faintly in the bitter air. Reverend Samuel Whitaker moved among them like a shepherd tending his flock, his clerical collar gleaming pale against the gloom. He stopped beside Sophia Hayes. The sheriff's granddaughter stared vacantly ahead, lips parted, her cup half raised but untouched. Whitaker's trembling hand reached down, closing around hers. His voice dropped to a hushed, reverent tone, as though he were offering her communion. "It is time, little one," he murmured. "Drink, and you shall be free." Margaret's heart seized. Her pulse thundered so loudly she could barely hear her own breath. "No," she cried, surging forward. "Stop!" Whitaker ignored her. He lifted the cup to Sophia's lips, tilting it gently. The dark liquid sloshed inside, carrying with it the sickly sweet chemical tang Margaret recognized all too well. Sophia's lips touched the rim. Something in Margaret broke. "Shadow." Her voice rang out sharp and desperate. "Take him down." For a split second, time froze. Shadow stiffened beside her, muscles, coiled, ears pinned back. He had been trembling with restraint, held back by months of fear, the ghosts of his own past. Thunder and gunfire had once shattered his courage, sent him cowering beneath beds. But now, faced with real danger, with children's lives hanging in the balance, something primal surged within him. He exploded forward. The growl that ripped from his chest was like nothing Margaret had ever heard, raw, feral, unstoppable. His paws slammed against the concrete claws, scraping sparks as he lunged. Whitaker's eyes widened in shock as 85 pounds of German Shepherd hurtled toward him. The cup slipped from his hand, dark liquid splattering across Sophia's blanket as Shadow collided with the pastor's chest. They crashed to the floor. Whitaker's cry cut short as Shadow's teeth bared inches from his throat. The dog's weight pinned him down, his snarls reverberating through the factory like rolling thunder. Margaret staggered forward, nearly collapsing with relief. "Good boy," she gasped. "Hold him." But the victory came too late for Sophia. Margaret turned and her heart fractured. The little girl had managed to swallow before Shadow struck, her face contorted, lips trembling as the drug burned through her system. The paper cup slipped from her hands, spilling the crimson liquid across the floor. Her small body shuddered, then convulsed violently. "No, no, no, no." Margaret dropped to her knees beside her, instincts of the battlefield nurse snapping to life. She swept the cup away, cradled Sophia's head in her hands, and searched frantically for signs. The girl's eyes rolled back, foam gathering at the corners of her mouth. Her tiny limbs jerked in uncontrolled spasms. "Poison," Margaret whispered, panic clawing at her chest. She forced herself to steady. "Stay with me, sweetheart. Stay with me." She tilted Sophia onto her side to keep her airway clear. Fumbling for anything, cloth, water, anything, but she had nothing but her own body and her training. She pressed 2 fingers against the girl's neck. A pulse, rapid and erratic, pounded weakly beneath her skin. Behind her, Whitaker thrashed beneath Shadow's weight, his voice ragged with desperation. "Release me," he roared. "You don't understand. I'm saving her." Shadow snarled, deepened teeth flashing inches from his throat. Spit flew as the dog barked savagely, warning with every ounce of authority in his bloodline that the pastor would not rise again. Margaret snapped her head toward him. "Hold him, Shadow. Don't let him move." The German Shepherd obeyed without hesitation. Body pressed firmly over the man's chest, paws digging into his arms to pin him. His amber eyes burned with determination. For the first time since his partner's death, Shadow had faced the storm inside him and conquered it. Margaret turned back to Sophia. The child's convulsions slowed her chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. The sweet chemical stench clung to her lips, and Margaret's stomach turned. She needed an antidote, medical support, something beyond her reach in this forsaken place. She gripped Sophia's cold hand. "You hold on, baby girl. Just a little longer." Her mind raced, airway breathing circulation. She had nothing to flush the toxins, no charcoal, no IV line. All she could do was stabilize, keep her alive until help arrived. But how long would that take in a storm like this? Her gaze darted to the other children. They still sat frozen in their circle cups, clutched in limp hands, eyes glassy. The drug had slowed their minds, dulled their wills, but they hadn't consumed enough yet. Margaret's chest heaved with determination. "Listen to me," she shouted at them. Her voice cracked, desperate but commanding. "Don't drink it. Spit it out. Stay awake." A few blinked, confusion flickering across their faces. One boy let his cup slip from his hands, liquid spilling harmlessly onto the floor. Margaret's heart lifted with fragile hope. Whitaker writhed beneath Shadow, his voice breaking into sobs. "You don't see. You don't see. Grace is waiting. She's waiting for them. I promised her." Margaret spun on him, fury igniting in her chest. "You promised your daughter love, not madness. Look at this child. She gestured to Sophia, convulsing in her lap. Look at what you've done. For a heartbeat, the old man's mask cracked. Horror flickered across his face as his eyes fell on the girl's trembling body. But the delusion reclaimed him just as quickly, and his lips curled into a twisted smile. She is on her way home. Shadow barked so violently that the children flinched again, the sound echoing like judgment through the rafters. His weight bore down harder growl, relentless, a living barrier between Whitaker and his flock. Margaret bent low over Sophia once more, pressing her ear to the girl's chest. The heartbeat was there, fragile but present. Relief coursed through her, but it was laced with terror. Without treatment, Sophia might not last the hour. She lifted her head, eyes darting to the factory's broken windows. Snow still whirled outside, but somewhere beyond it, the town was searching. Someone had to come. Someone had to hear. Margaret looked at Shadow. His body quivered with effort, but his eyes met hers steadily. For the first time, she didn't see fear in him. She saw command. "Good boy," she whispered fiercely. "Don't let him move. We'll make it through this." Sophia jerked again in her arms, her small body fighting against the poison. Margaret cradled her tighter, whispering into her ear. "Hold on, sweetheart. Just hold on. Help is coming." Sophia's small body convulsed in Margaret's arms, her limbs jerking violently as the poison coursed through her veins. Foam bubbled at the corners of her mouth, her eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. Margaret pressed trembling fingers against the girl's neck, desperate for a pulse. It was there, fluttering, frantic, slipping beneath her touch like a frightened bird. "Stay with me, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're not leaving me, not tonight." Her training clawed its way to the surface, old instincts from field hospitals where soldiers lay broken by shrapnel and gunfire. Airway breathing circulation, the holy trinity of survival. She rolled Sophia gently onto her side, angling her head to keep her airway clear. The girl's chest rose and fell in shallow spasms, her breaths ragged and erratic. Margaret stripped off her scarf and folded it beneath Sophia's head to keep her neck straight. She tilted the child slightly forward, coaxing the poisoned fluid to spill from her mouth. Her own heartbeat thundered in her ears, louder than the storm groaning through the rafters above. "You hold on, baby girl," she murmured. "Help is coming." A guttural growl rumbled behind her. Margaret turned her head just enough to see Shadow pinning Reverend Whitaker to the floor. The German shepherd's massive body straddled the pastor's chest, paws braced against his arms. His teeth gleamed in the lantern light, lips curled back in a snarl that vibrated through the cavern. Whitaker struggled weakly, his face twisted with anguish and fanaticism. "Release me," he shouted hoarsely. "You're delaying God's will." "She must be freed," Shadow barked savagely, his muzzle inches from the pastor's face. The sound cracked like a gunshot, silencing the children in their circle. They shrank back wide-eyed, the fog in their gaze flickering as reality tried to seep in. "Good boy," Margaret whispered. "Don't let him move." The dog growled again, steady and unyielding. His amber eyes flicked to Margaret for the briefest moment, and she felt it like a vow he would not fail her. Margaret fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. She pressed the emergency number, praying for a miracle. The screen glowed weekly bars of service rising and falling like a heartbeat. Static filled her ear when the call connected, broken by sharp bursts of sound. 911. "What's your emergency?" Margaret nearly sobbed with relief. "This is Margaret Collins," she shouted into the receiver. "I've found the missing children. They're at the Whitaker canning factory. One is poisoned. She's seizing. We need medical help now." The line crackled, faded, then returned. "Ma'am, repeat location, the Whitaker canning factory." Margaret yelled again, voice raw. "Send ambulances now, and officers, the Reverend is..." The line died, plunging her back into silence. No, she shook the phone, stared at the lifeless screen. Please, not now. Her breath fogged in frantic bursts. She had no idea if they'd heard enough, if help would come. All she could do was pray. The fragments of her words reached someone. Sophia's convulsions slowed, her body sagging against Margaret's lap. Panic clawed at her chest. Slowing wasn't always good. It could mean the poison had weakened her muscles too much. Margaret leaned close, ear pressed against the girl's mouth. A faint, rattling breath brushed her cheek. "Come on, little one," she whispered. "Don't you dare give up." Her mind raced through every battlefield trick she had ever learned. No antidote, no IV, no equipment, only improvisation and will. She forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly, because panic would kill them both faster than poison. Whitaker writhed again, his voice breaking into a keening cry. "You don't understand. The world is wicked. I promised Grace. This is the only way." Margaret's fury ignited. She lifted her head, glaring at him with fire she hadn't felt in years. "You promised your daughter love, not this madness. Look at her." She gestured to Sophia, limp and trembling. "Look at what you've done." For a moment, the old man faltered. His eyes, wild and bloodshot, flicked to the child. Pain cut across his face, real and raw. But then, the mask of fanaticism returned, hardening his features. "She will be with Grace. They all will." Shadow snarled again, pressing him harder into the concrete. His growl filled the air like a warning drumbeat, each vibration saying what Margaret could not. "Move again, and you will not rise." Minutes stretched into eternities. The storm outside battered the factory walls, rattling broken windows, screaming through jagged gaps like a chorus of ghosts. Every sound reminded Margaret of time slipping away, of Sophia's fragile heartbeat ticking down like the last grains in an hourglass. She whispered constantly into the girl's ear, words of comfort, of promise, of defiance. "You're strong. You're loved. Your grandfather is waiting for you. Don't you dare leave him." Sophia twitched faintly, a weak whimper escaping her lips. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Margaret clung to it as if it were proof of life itself. The other children sat frozen, their cups untouched in trembling hands. Fear flickered more brightly now, fighting against the chemical haze. Lucy Carter blinked rapidly, her eyes darting from Margaret to the snarling dog. Caleb Nguyen dropped his cup, liquid spilling across the floor, and pulled his knees to his chest. Margaret's heart surged with hope. The spell was breaking. The children were waking. "Listen to me," she called to them, voice sharp with urgency. "Don't drink it. Put the cups down. Stay awake. Stay with me." One by one, the cups clattered to the ground. Isabella Torres whimpered, tears streaking her cheeks. Ryan Brooks pressed his fists to his eyes. Oliver Bennett began to sob quietly, his small shoulders shaking. "They're just children," Margaret whispered fiercely, glaring at Whitaker. "And you tried to steal their lives." Her phone buzzed suddenly in her pocket. She yanked it out, fumbling to answer. Static again, then fragments of a voice. "Ma'am, repeat. Are you safe?" Margaret shouted into the receiver, every word a lifeline. "This is Margaret Collins. 6 children, Whitaker Canning Factory. 1 poisoned, needs urgent care. Reverend Whitaker is restrained. Send help now." The line stuttered, fell silent, then clicked dead once more. But she didn't care. They had heard. They had to have heard. Shadow growled sharply, as though agreeing. His stance never faltered, his eyes blazing with a clarity Margaret had thought he had lost forever. PTSD had haunted him for months, crippling him with storms and sounds. But tonight, in the face of true chaos, he was unshakable. The minutes crawled. Margaret kept her hands on Sophia's chest, monitoring each shallow rise and fall, whispering encouragement through clenched teeth. Her knees ached, her fingers stiffened with cold, but she refused to let go. "You're not dying here," she whispered fiercely. "Not while I have breath." The storm roared. The rafters groaned. Shadow's growl hummed like a bass line beneath it all. The factory had become a crucible of waiting. Waiting for sirens, for flashing lights, for salvation that might already be too late. Margaret lifted her head, eyes stinging with tears. She looked at Shadow, his powerful frame holding Whitaker immobile, his body vibrating with restrained fury. "You're a good boy," she whispered hoarsely. "The best." The dog's ears twitched at her voice, but his gaze never wavered from the man beneath him. The factory walls shuddered as the storm howled against them. But for Margaret, the only sound that mattered was Sophia's shallow, rattling breath in her arms. She whispered again and again. Words of comfort, words of command, anything to keep the girl tethered to life. Shadow's growl rumbled in the background, steady as a drum beat, keeping Reverend Samuel pinned beneath him. Then, faint at first, another sound broke through the storm. Sirens. Margaret's head snapped up. Blue and red lights flickered faintly through the snow-glazed windows, growing brighter by the second. Relief crashed over her so violently she nearly collapsed. "They're here," she whispered fiercely to Sophia. "Hold on, baby girl. They're here." The heavy doors burst open with a crash, snow sweeping in as officers flooded the space. Flashlights cut through the gloom, voices shouted commands. "Police! Hands where we can see them!" Shadow barked once, sharp and authoritative, before shifting slightly to let the officers see the man he had restrained. Reverend Whitaker lay still beneath the dog's weight, tears streaking his face, hands trembling at his sides. Two deputies rushed forward, weapons drawn, but froze at the sight of Shadow standing over the pastor. For a moment, the scene was almost surreal. A retired K-9, scarred by trauma, holding a dangerous man immobile until his brothers in blue could arrive. Margaret's voice rang out hoarse and urgent. "Over here! The children! Sophia needs immediate medical care!" Paramedics stormed inside, pushing stretchers through the snowdrifts. Margaret gently lifted Sophia into their arms, her heart tearing as the girl's head lolled against the medic's chest. Electrodes, oxygen, urgent words exchanged in clipped tones, everything moved in a blur. "Poison," Margaret said, her voice sharp with authority. "She swallowed it." The others didn't, not fully. "Move fast. Move." The medic nodded briskly. "We'll get her stabilized." As they worked, Margaret looked up to see Sheriff Hayes shoving through the crowd, his face ashen. His eyes landed on Sophia, limp and pale, and he stumbled forward. "Sophia!" His voice cracked. He reached out, but the paramedics pulled her stretcher toward the waiting ambulance. "No, please." Margaret caught his arm, steadying him. "She's alive," she whispered urgently. "She's fighting. They're taking her to the hospital now." Tears blurred the sheriff's eyes, but he managed a nod. He pressed his forehead briefly against Margaret's before stumbling after the paramedics. Meanwhile, officers dragged Reverend Whitaker to his feet. Shadow snarled as they pulled the pastor away, as though reluctant to surrender him. Margaret laid a calming hand on the dog's head, whispering softly until he eased back. Though his amber eyes never left the man, Whitaker didn't resist. He sagged between the deputy's grip, his face streaked with tears. His voice broke as he sobbed, not with guilt, but with conviction. "I was saving them," he wept. "You don't understand. I was saving them." His cries echoed through the vast, empty factory, chilling in their sincerity. The children huddled together, silent and shaken, their cups abandoned on the floor. Margaret's chest tightened. She wanted to scream at him, to demand how he could twist grief into such madness. But as she watched his frail body shuddering in their grasp, she saw not only a criminal, but a broken father who had lost himself in his own suffering. Hours later, in the sterile light of Cedar Falls General Hospital, the truth began to unfold. Sophia had been rushed into the emergency ward, doctors swarming to flush her system, stabilize her erratic pulse. Margaret sat in the waiting room with Shadow at her side, exhaustion pulling at her bones. The other children had been reunited with their frantic parents, their tears mingling with cries of relief. But Sophia's fate still hung in balance, and Sheriff Hayes paced the corridor like a man trapped between hope and despair. Dr. Helena Morris, a neurologist who had once treated Margaret's patients in the military, emerged from one of the consultation rooms. Her expression was grim, her hands folded tightly in front of her. Margaret rose to meet her, Shadow pressing against her leg as though to lend strength. "You've seen him?" Margaret asked. Dr. Morris nodded. "Yes, Reverend Whitaker is in custody, but they called me in to evaluate him. His behavior tonight wasn't only grief, Margaret. It was disease." Margaret's brow furrowed. "Disease?" The doctor's voice softened. "He's in the early stages of Alzheimer's. It's not just memory loss. It warps judgment, disorients time and reality. Pair that with the trauma of losing his daughter, and you have a perfect storm." He clung to scripture, to ritual, because it gave shape to the chaos in his mind. But somewhere along the way, the illness twisted grief into delusion. He truly believed he was rescuing those children. Margaret sank into a chair, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her. Shadow laid his head in her lap, his steady warmth grounding her. Dr. Morris continued, her voice heavy. "It doesn't excuse what he did, but it explains it. He wasn't a monster, Margaret. He was a father broken by loss, consumed by disease." Margaret's eyes burned with tears. She thought of Ethan, of her own nights spent whispering to the shadows, bargaining with God to give her son back. She had walked the edge of that abyss herself. Perhaps the only difference between her and Samuel Whitaker was that she had Shadow to hold her back when the darkness threatened to swallow her whole. Sheriff Hayes appeared then, his face etched with exhaustion, but his eyes fierce with determination. "Sophia's stable," he said hoarsely. "The doctors think she'll pull through." Relief buckled Margaret's chest. She pressed her forehead to Shadow's and whispered a thank you she could barely voice. Hayes glanced at her, his voice raw. "You saved her. You and that dog. I'll never forget it." Margaret shook her head, tears spilling freely now. "Shadow saved her. He saved us all." Shadow blinked up at her, his amber eyes calm. He didn't know the weight of the words, but he felt the love in them. Later, when the chaos had quieted and the storm outside softened to a weary hush, Margaret stepped into Sophia's hospital room. The girl lay pale but breathing, monitors beeping steadily beside her bed. Sheriff Hayes sat nearby, clutching her hand as if afraid to let go. Margaret stood quietly in the doorway, Shadow pressed to her leg. She thought of the factory, of the hymn echoing through crumbling walls, of the steaming cups lined up in perfect rows. She thought of Whitaker's broken sobs, his insistence that he was saving them. The storm passed with the dawn, leaving Cedar Falls buried beneath mountains of snow. The streets were quiet, muffled by white. But beneath the stillness pulsed a tension that would not thaw with the sun. The town was shaken, not by the storm's destruction, but by what had been uncovered within the crumbling walls of the Whitaker canning factory. 6 children had been found alive, one clinging to life in the hospital. Their parents had rushed to embrace them, tears mingling with shouts of relief. Yet every embrace was shadowed by the horror of what they had narrowly escaped. And at the center of it all stood Reverend Samuel Whitaker, the man who had once baptized their children, married their couples, buried their dead. A man they had trusted, who had guided them with scripture and kindness for decades. Now he was behind bars, weeping that he had been misunderstood, insisting he had saved those children, when in truth he had nearly destroyed them. The betrayal cut deep. On Sunday morning, the church sat half empty. Those who came sat stiffly in the pews, their hands clenched, their eyes darting to the pulpit that now stood deserted. Reverend Whitaker's absence was a wound, but so was the memory of his final sermon to the children in that factory. Some congregants wept openly, others sat stone-faced, anger simmering in their silence. The choir refused to sing, the organ remained closed. Trust had shattered. Parents wrestled with the knowledge that the man they had welcomed into their homes, the man who had blessed their babies, had also led their sons and daughters into danger. Some wanted to burn his memory from the town entirely. Others, remembering his years of service and the disease that had twisted his mind, could not bring themselves to condemn him fully. The debate divided households, friendships, even marriages. Was Whitaker a criminal or a broken man undone by grief and Alzheimer's? Should his name be cursed or pitied? The town teetered between fury and compassion, unable to settle on either. Margaret walked the snowy streets with Shadow at her side, hearing whispers that quieted when she passed. People looked at her differently now. Some with gratitude because she and Shadow had stopped Whitaker before it was too late. Others with unease because they remembered how close she had been to him, how she had once brought him casseroles when he was grieving Grace, how she had defended him at town meetings when people grumbled about his eccentricities. She felt the weight of their gazes, felt the question behind them. Had her friendship, however distant, blinded her? Had her bond with Shadow somehow been misread by Whitaker as a divine sign? The thought gnawed at her. In quiet moments, she replayed the pastor's words. God guided me. The signs were clear. The widow and her hound, proof of his will. Margaret shivered. Had Whitaker truly seen her and Shadow as omens? Had her attempt to heal herself and her broken dog been twisted into validation for his delusions? She couldn't shake the guilt. It was irrational, she knew that. She hadn't poisoned the children, hadn't forced them into the factory. But still, the line between her grief and Whitaker's blurred in her mind. She too had lost a child to a drunk driver. She too had wrestled with despair so thick it suffocated her. If not for Shadow, if not for the fragile lifeline of their bond, could she have fallen into madness as he had? The question haunted her. Town meetings grew heated in the weeks that followed. The parents demanded action. The Whitaker canning factory had long been an eyesore, a decaying monument to better days. Now it was a place of nightmares, a wound festering in the center of Cedar Falls. Voices rose and cracked in the crowded hall. "Burn it to the ground," one father shouted, pounding his fist on the table. "Erase it, so our children never have to see it again." "No," another argued, voice trembling. "Let it stand as a warning, so no one forgets what happened there." Sheriff Hayes, his face drawn by exhaustion and worry for Sophia's ongoing recovery, raised his hands for quiet. The factory cannot remain as it is. It has become a symbol of fear. Whatever we decide must honor what was almost lost and what was saved. Margaret sat in the back, Shadow resting at her feet. She listened to the fury, the grief, the confusion spilling from her neighbors. She knew their pain. She carried it too. When her turn came, she stood, her voice low but steady. We can't erase what happened, but we can choose what it means. That building doesn't have to be remembered for madness. It can be remembered for survival, for the children who came home, and for the lives still worth living. Silence followed her words. Then slowly, heads began to nod. The decision was made. The Whitaker factory would be demolished. In its place, a memorial park would rise, not just for the 6 children, but for all the losses Cedar Falls had endured. For Grace Whitaker, for Ethan Collins, for every soul taken too soon. On the day of demolition, the town gathered in the snow. Bulldozers rumbled, their engines drowning out the murmurs of the crowd. The old brick walls groaned, bricks tumbling in a cloud of dust and ice. Margaret stood at the edge, shadow pressed against her leg, watching as the structure collapsed. With each crash of stone and steel, she felt something inside her uncoil. It would never erase the memory, never undo the terror. But it closed a chapter. When the dust settled, the townspeople stepped forward, placing flowers in the rubble. Mothers and fathers wept. Children clutched tightly to their chests. Sheriff Hayes stood with Sophia, frail but recovering, her hand wrapped firmly in his. Margaret bent down, brushing her fingers through Shadow's fur. "We did it," she whispered. "We stopped it before it was too late." 3 months later, Cedar Falls looked different. Snow had melted into soft earth, and the ground where the Whitaker factory once stood had been cleared to a flat expanse. Spring flowers pushed stubbornly through the soil, defiant in their color. Where there had once been a monument to fear, there now lay the promise of something new. Life had not returned to normal. How could it? But it had begun to move again, cautious and tender. The children who had been taken were back in their homes. They still woke in the night with cries, still clung to their parents when the wind howled. But they were alive. And in Cedar Falls, that was enough. Sophia Hayes walked slowly across the hospital garden, her small hand clasped in her grandfather's. Her steps were uneven, her muscles still recovering from weeks of seizures and treatment. But each stride was stronger than the last. Sheriff Hayes matched her pace, his eyes never leaving her, as though afraid she might vanish if he looked away. "Careful," he murmured. Sophia gave him a brave smile, her lips pale but determined. "I can do it, Grandpa. Watch me." She took 2 more steps without help. Behind her, the other 5 children watched, cheering softly, their faces lit with cautious hope. Margaret stood nearby, her chest swelling at the sight. Beside her, Shadow sat tall, ears pricked, tail thumping lightly against the bench. His eyes tracked Sophia, alert yet calm, as though guarding her every breath. Margaret bent down and stroked the thick fur at his neck. "You see that? She's coming back to us. You helped do that." Shadow pressed his head into her palm, the scar of his past hidden beneath the warmth of the moment. Word of Shadow's courage had spread through Cedar Falls like fire through dry grass. People whispered about how he had pinned Reverend Whitaker until the deputies arrived, how he had stood guard over the children like a sentinel of justice. But in the weeks that followed, another side of him emerged, quieter, gentler. The children, once terrified of the dog's sharp bark and imposing size, began to seek him out. He would lie beside them during counseling sessions, his steady breathing calming their trembling hands. He would rest his head in their laps when their tears came, his amber eyes meeting theirs with a patience that no words could offer. Dr. Helena Morris, who had diagnosed Whitaker's illness, was the first to call it what it was: "He's more than a survivor," she told the town council. "He's a healer, a therapy dog in the truest sense." And so Shadow found his new calling, not chasing criminals or sniffing out danger, but helping children rebuild their sense of safety. Margaret, too, changed. For years she had lived in silence, her home echoing with memories of Ethan. Grief had walled her off, leaving her to drift through days without purpose. But in caring for Shadow, and in fighting to save the children, she had been drawn back into the heart of life. Now, the children visited her often. They came in pairs or in noisy groups, filling her once lonely house with clattering footsteps and shrieks of laughter. She baked cookies again, burned half the batches because she forgot to set timers and didn't care. Her kitchen smelled of cinnamon, her living room rang with joy. One evening, Sophia tugged at her hand as they sat on the porch. "Miss Margaret," the girl said softly, "you're like another grandma to me." Tears pricked Margaret's eyes. She pulled Sophia close, her heart breaking and mending at the same time. For the first time in years, the word family didn't hurt. It healed. The town gathered one Saturday morning for the dedication of the memorial park. Where the old factory had once loomed, a wide green space now stretched, dotted with benches, flower beds, and a fountain at its center. At the far end stood a stone engraved with names: Grace Whitaker, Ethan Collins, and the 6 children who had been saved. Margaret stood before it. Shadow at her side, the children clustered nearby. Parents held candles, their faces reflecting both sorrow and resilience. Sheriff Hayes stepped forward, his voice steady as he spoke. This ground was once a place of fear. But today, we reclaim it. Today, we say that grief will not have the last word, that love and hope and the laughter of our children will rise stronger than the darkness that tried to claim them. Applause rippled softly through the crowd. Sophia leaned against her grandfather's leg, her hand brushing Shadow's fur. The dog leaned into her touch, calm and proud. That afternoon, the park transformed. Children scattered across the grass, their laughter ringing like bells. Parents watched with tear-streaked smiles, grateful simply to see their little ones run free. Margaret sat on a bench beneath a blooming cherry tree, her heart full in a way she hadn't thought possible again. Shadow bounded across the lawn, his tail streaming, ears perked. The 6 children chased him, their cries of delight echoing into the sky. He darted one way, then another, letting them nearly catch him before pulling ahead again. Sophia stumbled once but laughed, her voice stronger than it had been in months. Oliver tripped over his own feet, rolling into the grass, and Shadow trotted back to nudge him upright, with a gentle push of his nose. The sight made Margaret's throat tighten. She pressed her hands together, whispering softly to herself, "Ethan, I wish you could see this." Perhaps in some quiet corner of eternity, he could. As the sun sank low, casting gold across the park, the children collapsed in the grass, breathless with laughter. Shadow flopped among them, his chest heaving, his tongue lolling in contentment. They buried him in hugs, small hands tangled in his fur, their giggles rising into the warm evening air. Margaret rose and walked toward them, her steps slow but steady. For so long her life had felt like ashes, cold, gray, lifeless. But now, watching Shadow and the children, she saw something new blooming in those ashes, something alive, something eternal, a family, not of blood, but of bond. Shadow rolled onto his back, paws in the air as the children squealed with delight. Margaret laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years. And as the sound carried over the park, mingling with the children's joy, it became clear. Cedar Falls had scars, but it also had hope. The garden was alive with voices, the air thick with love. And at the heart of it all ran a German shepherd named Shadow, once broken, now whole, a symbol of healing and the unyielding power of love.